describe what I think was going on in the text, it became clear to me I didn't have a strong enough explanation for myself. Right? So really what I intended to do is talk about when you have clear commandments in a passage, a wisdom hermeneutic, how do we deal with that? But then I decided, no, I need to go back and read Leviticus again, because I've never done an exegesis on either of these passages. And so now we are here today with a different presentation, right? So, but I still kept this slide in. All right, all Scripture is useful for teaching, correcting, rebuking, training in justice, right? To prepare us for good, for the works that we should be doing in the world. And I think that there are passages that we have our doubts about, and sometimes that's the whole Old Testament. Last year, I wrote an article in response to Andy Stanley's book Unhitched. What was it called? Unhitched is what he wants us to do with the Old Testament. Where he'd written a book saying that we should unhitch ourselves from the Old Testament, and especially its moral discussions, which I thought was very interesting for Andy Stanley to come to that position. But he's really like, we should focus on the New Testament, not worry about the moral implications and the complications that come from the Old Testament. So I wrote this article in Christianity Today responding to him. And because I am a person who still thinks that even our troublesome scriptures can still speak to us and be conversations, partners for us in developing in wisdom and in holiness, even while we disagree with them. The problem was that I don't know that we've actually done right by the Leviticus passages in and of themselves. Are we disagreeing with the right thing? This is why I tell my students all the time, one of the reasons you're in this class is to decide if you disagree with something, do you actually disagree with the right thing? Do you know what it actually says? Right? So my proposal here today, unexpectedly to me a month ago or something, is that I think these translations are not accurate. And I'll tell you why here in a minute. So these are the two standard these are the NRSV translations here. You should not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. And so then the second version of this in 2013 actually picks up here and repeats, right? So we've added a subject into the clause. If a man lies with a male, as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination, they shall be put to death, their blood guilt is upon them. So we have an expansion on the original prescription that is fronted and has a second end to it. Now, so what I've done here is put the NRSV on one side, and on the other side, I've tried to be as literal as possible, and even then it's very difficult. There are no prepositional phrases. There's no prepositions in this sentence. So it's actually really difficult to read. And if we don't know Hebrew, we don't know how difficult it is. So this is my best, as literal as possible, version of this passage. A male, you should not lie down the lying downs of a woman. That's a very clear sentence, don't you think? Right? So, and it looks like this is what we call an adverbial accusative, right? So that the verb to lie down is then the noun, the adverb, the lying down. So how do we do that, right? So the lying down as with the lying downs of a woman, which makes sense in terms of where we got our translation. But what I'm really interested in is this plural lying downs. Now, so as not an unimportant aside, everybody thinks that this text says what we've always thought it said. So Gordon Venham wrote the New International Commentary on the Old Testament, on Leviticus, and he doesn't even deal with the structure of any of these words. He just deals with the word abomination that occurs later in this verse. He doesn't deal with this at all. It just feels like we don't have to talk about it. Jacob Milgram, who has written 3 volumes on Leviticus, right, Jewish scholar, accepts this translation, doesn't deal with it, but more with, well, what do we do with it sort of beyond once we know what it's doing? He doesn't really deal with this, and in particular, it doesn't deal with this plural, which is going to be the most significant thing that I have to say today. So, Ryan, what are we talking about? Here's a very interesting situation here. One is that the male here is not the normal word that we have for man or husband. So the word ish for one person in the room who knows what that word is for sure, right? I was like, I've read Leviticus 3 times in Hebrew, which I feel like is more times than anybody of you have read it in English. But anyway, so this word is male, used 81 times in the Hebrew Bible, but it's not matched up with its counterpart, female. It's actually matched up with the word woman, isha, which occurs 780 times, but mostly in reference to a wife. Right? So it's not husband and wife, and it's not male and female, it's male and wife. So that was my first problem. And I know you're going, this is really entertaining. Where's this going, right? But for the moment, all I want us to notice is that there's this generic male that should not lie down the lying downs of a wife, specifically. Okay, so that's step number one. Hopefully this is all going to get clear in another 10 minutes, right? So lie down, I got that. Now what are we talking about with the lying downs part, right? So a male should not lie down with the lying downs of a woman. Lay down is a euphemism for sex, duh, right? I mean, that part I think is pretty secure. But interestingly, the word lying downs occurs here in Leviticus 18:22, again in Leviticus 20:13, and in one other place in all of the Hebrew Bible. And it is in Genesis 49:4. So this is one of those places where the patriarch is giving a blessing to their children, which doesn't sound much like a blessing, right? So Jacob is blessing Reuben, his firstborn, but he's saying basically you've been removed from the preeminence of being the firstborn because you went and up onto your father's beds, which is the other place where we have this plural of lying down. So what I have is a lying down in places where we lie down. So on your father's beds. And in this case, Reuben lay with Bilhah, which is one of Jacob's concubines. But I think the reason that we have this plural is the sense of if you violated one of the beds of your father, then you violated all the beds. So because he didn't go, according to the text, and sleep in all the beds, just Bilhah's. But because of the way the culture sort of looked at marriage and exposing your father's nakedness, which comes up in Leviticus all the time, it's once you've done one, you've done them all. So what we have here, I think, then, is don't take a male, right? This is actually, the male here is an object. Don't take a male and lay them down in your wives' beds. So A, this passage recognizes we live in a culture with polygamy. B, in addition to that, we have concubines. But also, I think what we're inferring here, in my mind, is the use of slaves. Right? So the passage that we should be most familiar with, unfortunately, is Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. Right? So they've got a problem here, right, about in terms of not having children. Obviously, it has to be Sarah's fault. Right, so then we're going to have Abraham lay with Hagar. And so we use a slave however we want to. Now, interestingly enough, right, I mean, what we don't know, because we're only familiar with the biblical story, is that in the ancient Near East, the culture in which this is produced, there are all kinds of teachings and practices to deal with male impotence. There are actually ritual practices. So if you're older and you kind of know it has to be my fault, right, because I've married someone younger and I can't produce, then what do? Or if I'm in a situation where I've married somebody and then I marry somebody else and we're still not producing children, then that's probably going to be on me. Right? So what I think is going on here is we have a prescription dealing with the fact that if I have a situation like Sarah, Hagar, and Abram, and I'm the man and I realize it's my fault, and I'm going to send in another male, a slave, to go sort of work on this issue of procreation, right? That's actually a violation of the desires of God in terms of family structure. Okay? So now, I've come to I'm skipping over to Leviticus 20:13 and thinking about the whole sentence, because the way the sentence begins in Leviticus 18 is with the male who's being sent in, right? It's just sort of here's the object, but we don't have the subject. This actually fills it all out. So a husband who lays a male as on the beds of a wife has done something taboo. The two of them should be put to death. Their blood guilt is upon them. Now let's talk about this. To me then, like the section is actually 20:10 through 14. This verse actually seems to me to make more sense in the context of what's going on here. So, for example, 20:10 says that a man and a woman who commit adultery, they're to be put to death. Marital structure. 20:11 and 12 consigns someone who lays with their mother-in-law, or if someone lays with their daughter-in-law, to death. Right? So then this is the third one, and instead of having sort of the introduction of homosexuality, we have a different form of the violation of a wife and a husband's relationship, in this case with a slave. And then finally, right, the furthest one out in terms of marriage is if you decide you're going to marry the mother and the daughter, then all of you get put to death. Double bonus, okay? Right? So one of the interesting things here in terms of the two of them shall be put to death, I think this is actually the husband and the male who have decided that we've conjured up this idea that it's going to cause, as we know from the Hagar, Sarah, Abram story, all kinds of troubles. And, right, I mean, especially if you're violating this relationship, then whose child is that, right? Ishmael and Isaac, right? The whole split between them, the problems that they have would be replicated if you allowed this sort of thing to happen in the marriage in your culture, right? So we want to avoid that as much as possible, right? So to me, the reading, I say right, as if you agree with me, but I assume you did because I put all these words on the screen. This reading of the text means that we don't have the outlier in 2013, that we've moved suddenly to homosexuality. What it means is we stayed within the confines of marriage, but we keep going to, well, here's a weird situation, here's a situation really weird, and then like, whoa, like someone decides we're going to marry a mother and her daughter. What, you know, like, okay, so that's the furthest of those kinds of circumstances rather than the insertion of the male-female, of the homosexual passage here. So I'm doing pretty well on my time, good. So the way forward here, right? I mean, one of the things that I want to do is like, so when I went back and read the text, especially starting in 1823, 22, you know, I was like, I really don't know what this passage says. Gordon Wenham decides that we don't even have to deal with it. We don't have to deal with the Hebrew at all. We just skip it. And I'm like, well, I mean, I've read this passage a few times, assuming what what it said, and went back and read it slowly and went, I have no idea what we're talking about here. And so I had to revisit just the grammar, then the language, and what could be going on in culture. We had to revisit that a second time. And again, Jacob Milgram knows what he's talking about. Major Jewish scholar and very thorough, but he also assumes the grammar and what's going on in culture. And I just found that interesting. So I'd love for us to think that, no, we really need to come back and think about these texts at least a second time and not be so confident that we know what that is. And that's what scholarship is intended to do. The second thing is, you know, the sort of the broader thing that I always want us to remember is that here in this particular case, right, I mean, the questions are, what are holy sexual relationships? Leviticus 28 is asking that question. Leviticus 18 is asking the question of what makes us distinct from the nations that are around us. I still think those are very good questions, and we can go observe how these early writers sort of dealt with those questions, and we might, we've made some decisions about how we feel like our culture has moved beyond that, but we still want to have those conversations and listen to the wisdom of the writers of Leviticus, sort of thinking about how does the culture function, what's it doing, and so then how do we think about our culture and what we're doing, right? We still benefit from their wisdom and thinking about what are holy relationships, what makes us distinct as the people of God, even if in the end we're not going to agree with necessarily the outcomes, the prescriptions of Leviticus. And finally, right, I mean, one of the things, like, I spend a lot of time writing on the Old Testament. I'm writing on Haggai, Zechariah, which I also feel like I've read more than most anybody in this room, right? But I don't want us to get rid of the Old Testament. But at the same time, one of the things that's important about that is if we don't get rid of the Old Testament, part of this thing is we're having a conversation with Scripture. There are so many times when we assume that we know what the text has said. And actually, we're bad partners with Scripture. We actually haven't heard what Scripture says. We've assumed we know what Scripture says rather than listening to it clearly. And so this will get written up eventually and sent off to a journal that we hope will be accepted, and the conversation will begin again. But that was my experience, thinking I knew what Leviticus said, and then going back and read it very carefully and saying, I have no idea, actually. And so I started over, and this is where I came to before I arrived here today. So thank you for your time.